David Trickey. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist, and I'm going to tell you a bit about the Children's Global Assessment Scale, or the CGAS. Now, the CGAS is a pretty rough and ready measure, and it answers a single, simple question. On a scale from 1 to 100, how is the young person doing? It's a little bit more precise than that because it provides clear guidance so that different people will use the 1 to 100 scale in roughly the same way. It doesn't provide any information about the type of difficulties the young person has. It just describes how much those difficulties are affecting them, how much are those problems getting in the way of them getting on with things in their life. It's useful for use with children and young people aged 4 and above. It's incredibly quick because you are simply assigning a single number to how well they are doing, and it's available within System 1. The scale is split into bandings of 10, and here on the screen you can see the overall heading, if you like, for each of those bands. Now it would be worth getting a hold of a copy of the CGAS now if you haven't done so already, so feel free to pause this video and go and get a copy. You can find it either within System 1 or you can download it from the internet. You'll find it very easily. The easiest way, I think, to get a good version of it is if you just Google Royal College Psychiatrists and CGAS. Probably the first hit will be a document that includes all the information that you're going to need. So feel free to go and get one of those because you won't be able to read everything on the slides. CGAS also provides more detailed description for each of those bandings. Now, I'm not expecting you to be able to read all of that on the slide, but we're going to come back to this later on as we start to try and use it in actual practice. But at this stage, it's worth saying something about the way that you can use the data that the CGAS produces. So how can you use those numbers? It's tempting to think of the scores as similar to measuring something with a ruler, but actually that might not be very useful because although the scores on the CGAS are ordered, so a higher score represents a higher level of functioning, the interval between the numbers is not necessarily the same. So the difference between a score of 40 and 50 is not necessarily the same as the difference between a score of 50 and 60. And also a score of 60 doesn't really mean that the young person is doing twice as well as someone with a score of 30. So in statistical terms, we think of this as being ordinal data because it's in order, but not interval or ratio data. It would be more akin to the ratings that you might see in a curry house for how hot a curry is. And you see the different number of peppers. So you might have 1 pepper would be mild, 2 peppers would be medium, and 3 peppers would be hot. So we're not suggesting that the hot curries, the 3 peppers, are 3 times as hot as a mild one. That doesn't really make sense. And we're not suggesting that the difference in heat between a mild and a medium one is the same as the difference between a medium and a hot one. Now, what this means from a statistical point of view is that you can't really use the mean average, the normal average of a group of scores. But you could use the median average. What we mean by median is the middle score of a group of scores. We'll talk a bit more about this in a moment. Now, how do you go about using the CGAS? How do you determine a score? Well, first of all, you think about a fixed timescale. Usually, we would be thinking about 1 month. And then you think about how the young person was doing when they were at their worst, when things were the most difficult for them within that time frame. And then you use those headings that I showed you for the bandings, not the detailed description. And sometimes it's best to work your way down the scale until you reach a banding that is too low for your client. And then you go up 1. And then you look at that description within that banding and see if it fits. And then you decide, are they nearer the top or nearer the bottom or roughly in the middle of that banding? And then you rate them accordingly. I'm going to give you some examples of this in a moment. Now, it's useful to do this in discussion with colleagues, particularly as you first start to get used to it. And it's also useful every now and then actually to continue to do it in discussion, just to sort of make sure you're using it in the same sort of way as people around you. So I'm going to show you 2 vignettes, 2 short descriptions of young people, and these have come from the Northamptonshire Mental Health Gateway, and they were originally used in a study called the Children and Young young person's inpatient evaluation study. As you look at them, you'll want ready access to those detailed descriptions of the bandings. So as I've said, you could either print them from that slide that I showed you earlier, you could find them on the Royal College of Psychiatrists website. So here's Tina. Feel free to pause this video whilst you read this. I'm not going to read this out to you. So once you're a little bit familiar with Tina's story, then, as I said, the first thing you do is you look at the bandings and you work your way down until you get too low. Now you might think 50 to 51 to 60, some noticeable problems in more than one area. Well, I'd say although she's doing okay in some areas, actually her difficulties are more severe than just noticeable. So I might go down the next one, 41 to 50, some obvious problems, moderate impairment in most areas or severe in one. Well, I'm not sure. That might be right. Let's go down another one and see what happens. 31 to 40, serious problems, major impairment in several areas and unable to function in one area. I think that's too low. So I would go back up to that 41 to 50. And then you read the detailed description and work out, well, where is she in that? Is she near the top, near the bottom, or roughly in the middle? Just before I tell you what I think, what do you think? What are your thoughts about this? Let's look at this description here. Obvious problems, moderate impairment in most areas or severe in one area. A moderate degree of interference in functioning in most social areas or severe impairment in functioning in one area, such as might result from, for example, suicidal preoccupations and ruminations, school refusal and other forms of anxiety, obsessive rituals, major conversion symptoms, frequent anxiety attacks, frequent episodes of aggressive or other antisocial behavior, with some preservation of meaningful social relationships. Well, I reckon that Tina would fall roughly in the middle of that, perhaps a little bit higher than the middle. So I might go something like 46. I'd be interested to know where you were thinking. Were you around that? Were you a bit higher? Were you a bit lower? Were you a lot higher or a lot lower? Well, let's think about another one. Jack, and again, just feel free to pause the video and read the vignette for Jack. And then we do exactly the same thing. Once you're familiar with some of his background and some of the difficulties that he's having, you start with those bandings, you work your way down until you're sort of too low, till it feels like it's too low. And when you get down to the 21 to 30 severe problems, unable to function in almost all situations, well, Jack is getting to school, albeit with some difficulties. So I'm not quite sure he's in there. So I might go up one to 31 to 40. And then I would read this detailed description. Major impairment in several areas, unable to function in one. And go ahead and read that description. And I think it's probably towards the lower end of that, but not right at the bottom. So I'd probably go something like 33. And again, what do you think? What do your colleagues think? If you're doing this together with others, where did everyone else go? It's just to try and make sure we're all using it in roughly the same way. As I said at the beginning, it's rough and ready. It's not a precise measurement, but it's just to make sure we're using it in as a consistent way as possible. And then how do you use the numbers? What can you do? What's the point of doing this? Well, there's a number of things you can do, which I think are quite useful. One of them is that you can track a single person over time. So this might be something you take to supervision, for example. And at referral, you might rate them as sort of mid-50s, some noticeable problems. When it comes around to the initial assessment, you might actually have a better idea of what's going on for them, so that you might actually then have a more accurate rating, or things might have got worse for them. And it might be in the lower banding there of obvious problems. Then halfway through your work with them, maybe things are getting a bit better, but still some pretty noticeable problems. And then when it comes to discharge, they're up there in the kind of the doing all right banding of 71 to 80. You can also use the CGAS to rate a number of people over time. And again, this is something you might take to supervision with a number of your clients, and you can just see how things progress over time. And it might be interesting with these three people that I've represented here, how come one of them has still got obvious problems at discharge? Well, maybe they've been referred on to another service. How come one of them actually seemed to make a big improvement between the middle of treatment and the end rather than all the way through? So it's just a way of tracking how people are doing, and then you can start to have conversations about what's going well and what might need a bit of work. You could also compare the spread of scores at 2 time points for a group of clients, for example, between initial assessment and discharge. So if, for example, you might take your most recent 50 discharges, the ones that you have the data for, because it might be you don't have numbers for all of those 50 discharges. So you find 50 or a group of any number you like with data, so before and after data. And here you can see the bandings. So for an initial assessment, you may well have more than half having obvious problems, and you may have a big chunk with some noticeable problems. And then there may be some where they've only got a few problems, and there may be one or two where actually they're doing okay. And it might just be that at initial assessment, you're able to get more data, more information to make a more accurate assessment, or it might be things have improved between the referral being accepted and the initial assessment. And then at the point of discharge, well, how does those same young people map out in terms of the different bandings that they're in? Well, if you work our way down, there may be a big chunk of them doing okay, doing all right. And there may be some that still have some problems. Now, given the sorts of young people that make it to CAMS, it's likely that when we discharge them, there are still some problems going on, but hopefully things are a lot better than when we first met them. And there may be some where there's still some noticeable problems, and maybe some where there's actually some obvious problems. And maybe they've been moved on to another service, or maybe they've moved out of area. And another way you could use the CGAS scores is to compare the average score for different groups. For example, at referral time for different services. Now, when I say average, remember we're talking about the median score, so the middle score, rather than the normal average that we think of, the mean average. And it might be that for a service such as a counselling service, the median score is between 60 and 70, where the middle score, people have got some problems. And then there may be a low intensity service where they have some noticeable problems. In specialist CAMS, they may have some obvious problems. And with inpatient admission, the median score might be serious problems. In a way, if your scores fell like that, well, that would imply that you're doing something right in terms of which young people are ending up at which service. But if it doesn't look quite as clear cut as that, well, that is an interesting thing that might be worthy of discussion, and you may need to adjust the referral criteria for different services. And similarly, rather than just looking at the median, you could look at the spread of scores for different services. For example, add assessment for 2 different services. You may not have the same numbers. Now, I've made these graphs to show the actual numbers rather than the percentages, but you could do it whichever is going to be most useful for your purposes. So this is just fictitious data, but here you might have specialist CAMS where a good chunk of them have got obvious problems, and there's also a big chunk of them with some noticeable problems. And then there's a few that have some problems, and just 1 or 2 that actually, when you come to rate them at assessment, they seem to be doing okay. As I've said, that might be things have improved since referral, or maybe things on the referral form were exaggerated in order to get the referral in. So this might raise an interesting question. How come some young people that are doing all right actually are being assessed by a specialist CAM service? And then for a lower intensity service, you may have a few with obvious problems and a small group with some noticeable problems, but a big chunk of them might have some problems. So they're doing better, generally speaking, and there may be a few more that are doing all right. So this isn't a competition, but this is about just working out what sorts of difficulties, by which I mean how severe are those difficulties, what sorts of people are reaching different services. In terms of further information, the original paper, which includes the scale that first looks at it, this is by Schaefer and colleagues. This was back in 1983. There's a paper by Shaw and Van Vyk in 2004, which is actually a nice overview. It gives you a lot more information, not just for the CGAS, but a couple of other measures. The Royal College of Psychiatrists CGAS scoring guide is a very useful, very simple document. There is some free online training if you wanted to take this a bit further. You need to register for it, but it's free. And there are some more vignettes if you wanted to practice. This would be a useful thing, I think, to do within some team meetings, just to see how you get on and see whether people are using it in roughly the same sort of way. Anyway, so that's your sources for further information. I hope this has been useful. Take care and good luck.